Tonight, open for business.
This is a good compromise.
Congress clears the way to funding the government into next year, even as Republicans and Democrats are at tenterhooks over another multi-trillion-dollar spending bill.
They want to try the crazy strategy of inflating their way out of inflation.
Plus, after the first case of the COVID-19 Omicron variant in the U.S., the White House kicks off an urgent campaign for booster shots, even amid a legal battle over vaccine mandates. And
I knew that there was something so much richer and deeper to the story.
Meet the Christmas Cabinet. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
America putting a plan in place to prevent the spread of COVID. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm John Jessup.
Good evening, I'm Jenna Browder. The White House announcing a new list of actions to combat COVID. This as concern grows about the Omicron variant.
Second and third case now confirmed here in the United States, one in Minnesota, the other in Colorado. President Biden announcing several new policies today he believes will help keep Americans healthy this winter.
CBN National Security Correspondent Caitlin Burke has the latest on the administration's response. Caitlin.
Jenna, the president's winter plan for fighting COVID really revolves around enhanced availability of booster shots and vaccines.
Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins believe if you're worried about Omicron variant, the best thing to do is get fully vaccinated and then get your booster shot when you're eligible.
Pharmacies will soon be offering more appointments and walk-in hours, and families will be able to get shots together. New clinics opening nationwide, offering both boosters and vaccines as sort of an accessible one-stop shop. When it comes to combating the spread of the virus, the White House will be expanding free at-home testing.
I'm announcing that health insurers must cover the cost of at-home testing, so that if you're one of the 150 million Americans with private health insurance, next month your plan will cover at-home tests.
Now, for those not covered by private insurance, free tests will be available at community centers and other public locations. When it comes to travel, starting early next week, all international travelers will be required to test negative within 1 day of their departure to the United States. Biden also talked about efforts to help states respond to COVID cases and a commitment to continue shipping vaccines out to foreign nations. No major new restrictions or mandates were announced, but the White House is calling for an extension of the mask mandate on airplanes, buses, and trains through March. John and Jenna?
All right, CBN National Security Correspondent Caitlin Burke. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Here with us now is CBN medical reporter Lori Johnson. Lori, earlier this week, President Biden described the Omicron variant as a cause for concern, not panic. Lori, how do you view today's announced plan? Is the administration overreacting, or is this a measured response?
Well, you know, John, from a policy standpoint, that is, a lot of people were concerned that we might be hearing about lockdowns and closures, mandates, regulations, and we really heard very little of that. In fact, from a policy standpoint, not very much has changed. As Caitlin mentioned, the big one is what a lot of people consider to be good, which is people who are flying from other countries into the United States. They have to be tested for COVID 1 day before they get on that plane, and that's replacing the 3-day out rule. So a lot of people think that that's actually a good thing to keep the virus, or try to keep the virus out of the United States. And then, of course, masks on public transportation through March 18th. That's not that big of a deal. And then the good thing is insurance companies are going to pay for the tests, the rapid tests, the at-home tests. And we've heard so much about the value of testing, so that's likely to increase.
Yeah. Lori, aren't most Omicron cases pretty mild? That's what the South African doctor who first identified the variant seemed to say.
Right. So now we know that there are 3 cases of the Omicron variant that have been detected in the United States. One in Colorado, that's the latest one, a woman who is vaccinated, someone who is in Minnesota also vaccinated, and a person in San Francisco vaccinated. And Jenna, as you mentioned, mild cases in South Africa. But again, a lot of these patients are people who have immunity. Many of them have immunity from already recovering from COVID. COVID, and some of them have had vaccination, and most of them are under age 40, so they're naturally going to have mild cases just because they're young and healthy. So all of these cases, yes, are mild. Thank God. But we still have yet to see how the Omicron variant is going to react to people who are older, people who are sicker, and people who have no immunity from not being vaccinated or not having recovered from it. So that's the big question mark. We have to be careful not to get a false sense of security before we have all the answers.
An important point you make there, Lori. How long before we have a better understanding of this variant and whether vaccines still prove effective, or if Omicron makes people more or less sick on the whole, as you were just mentioning, not just the younger people, but also the wider demographic, including older people?
Right, exactly. So it's going to be a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. And the reason is because scientists across the country are testing whether the vaccines are protective against the Omicron variant. They take blood from people who are fully vaccinated and in a laboratory. Then they add the Omicron variant to it. Some of these are Omicron variants that have actually been grown, actually the virus. Others are synthetic versions, and they see if the blood from the vaccinated people can dismantle, can neutralize, can attack this Omicron variant, and if so, to what degree. So that's what we have to wait on. It's going to be a couple more weeks.
All right, CBN News medical reporter Lori Johnson. Lori, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the countdown is on for Congress, which has until midnight tomorrow to fund the federal government or contend with a possible weekend shutdown.
Yeah, while the House has announced an agreement, the discretionary spending bill still has to pass the Senate. CBN News correspondent Brody Carter is following the year-end chaos on Capitol Hill. Brody, this is nothing new.
John, Jenna, it's a familiar year-end item to approve funding and raise the debt ceiling to keep the government running. This covers things like Medicare, tax refunds, Social Security, and military salaries. The White House is confident Congress will approve all measures. If not, the government could default on its legal obligations, an unprecedented event in American history.
We were supposed to have taken care of all this back in September, but in the 7 years I've been in Congress, not once have we funded the government by the legal deadline. We just changed the deadlines.
Congress continues to kick the proverbial can down the congressional calendar by extending the fiscal year deadline. Even if all goes well by midnight Friday, lawmakers will have to do this again in February. House Appropriations Committee Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro released a statement that an agreement has been reached on a continuing resolution that would temporarily fund the government at the previous year's levels until a larger bipartisan agreement can be reached on spending for the new year.
Our men and women in uniform depend on that. Our veterans depend on that. There's so much in the legislation that addresses our national security. And again, the sooner we can pass the full bill, the better.
The continuing resolution doesn't come without political dissension. The House Freedom Caucus and other GOP members want Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell to use funding the president's vaccine mandate as a political bargaining chip.
We're not going to go for their anti-vaxxing, okay? So if you think that's how we're going to keep government open, forget that.
We're not going to shut the government down. That makes no sense for anyone. Almost no one on either side thinks that's a good idea.
The other major agenda item, a vote on the $2 trillion Build Back Better Act. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer set a Christmas timetable to finish the bill. And if the Senate can't deliver, the House will have to hold another vote. Lawmakers are calling this a failure to govern because it's taken 2 temporary resolutions before reaching a full agreement to cover the 2022 fiscal year. Now it's up to the Senate. Now, Democrats need 10 Republicans to avoid a crisis. The final vote is needed by Friday at midnight. John, Jenna, back to you.
All right, Brady Carter, thank you. Well, tonight the labor market is on a slow track to pre-pandemic levels. Jobless claims in this week's report leveling off lower than expected. The unemployment numbers come in as workers are quitting their current jobs for new ones at a record level. Jobless claims for the last week came in at 220,000. That's lower than expected, but still higher than the 194,000 unemployment claims the previous week. Continuing unemployment claims dropped below 2 million for the first time since the pandemic. And joining us now is Mark HAMRICK, Senior Economic Analyst and Washington Bureau Chief at BANKRATE. Mark, it's always good to see you. Thank you for coming back on the program. So things looking good in the labor market this week. Of course, tomorrow we get the monthly jobs report. What are you expecting with that?
Well, the positive story, Jenna, good to see you, is that we've had a fairly steady recovery since a bit of a slowdown in the economy over the summer related to the Delta variant. And here we are yet again talking about a different variant, which raises new uncertainty. But for what we know right now, we expect that we'll add on the order of 500,000 jobs in the month of November. The most recent reading on the nation's unemployment rate was at 4.6%. The consensus among economists is that that may go down to 4.5, maybe even slightly below that. And of course, we think about the fact that in February of 2020, before the pandemic began to really tighten its grip on the economy, we were at 3.5%. So we're tiptoeing toward that number. Right now, the biggest theme in the economy, as we've talked about many times, is the shortage of available workers and the large number of job openings. Quite the contrary of the 22 million jobs that were lost in March and April of last year.
Mark, this is a bit off topic, so let me just get this out of the way. Love the Christmas tree in the backdrop. This week, the newly renominated Fed chief officially retired the word transitory to describe inflation. Jerome Powell adding in a congressional hearing that he expects it to carry over into next year. Mark, what does that signal to you?
Well, that signals that, first of all, transitory had been fired earlier, so retiring, it's a little late. And really what they were talking about there is that inflation has been a bigger problem than our central bankers had expected, and that's because the supply chain issues have really persisted, and those don't look to be fully resolved for some time to come. Think about the fact that the Federal Reserve has already begun taking its foot off the accelerator with respect to the economy. That is an analogy for the billions of dollars in monthly asset purchases it's now dialing back from. And the next step, perhaps in the middle of next year, if not before, is to begin to raise interest rates and to put the foot on the brake. Interest rates would probably still remain at relatively low levels, but the cost of borrowing will probably begin to rise more substantially once we get into the middle part of next year.
Powell also signaling an early end to the Fed's bond buyback program. That news and also fears of the emerging Omicron variant sending markets on a roller coaster ride this week. Mark, what does that potentially mean for the economy?
Well, if the economy performs well over the intermediate term, I don't think we have too much to worry about. The big issue of uncertainty has been raised by the emergence of this variant. And as we heard in the earlier segment, we have to be patient here and hope that we have some questions that are answered in a positive fashion. And if that's the case, then I think everything should proceed pretty well. Remember, the outlook for growth next year is quite strong currently. And we expect the unemployment rate to continue to edge lower from already fairly low levels. So that's a pretty good outlook. We really need to see whether inflation begins to recede. And the Fed is telling us that it will begin to use one of the major hammers in its toolbox, raising interest rates if it needs to.
All right, Mark HAMRICK with BANKRATE. It's always good to have you on the show. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, John and Jenna.
Coming up, a new Texas law over abortion and what the Supreme Court ruling on a Mississippi case could mean for all Americans. Welcome back. Tonight, Texas is set to implement a second major law putting new restrictions on abortion in the Lone Star State. The new measure would limit chemical abortions, making it illegal for doctors to prescribe pills to medically induce abortions after 49 days into a pregnancy. Well, joining us now, Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council. Tony, always great to see you here on Faith Nation. Texas is implementing this latest law restricting abortion even before we've heard back from the Supreme Court over the September law effectively banning abortions in the state after a heartbeat is detected. Tony, what does that tell you?
Well, John, first it tells me the reason that the court took up the issue yesterday of Dobbs is because state legislatures have been doing their job. For the last decade, they have been addressing the issue that Congress has not and the courts imposed upon the nation, and that is protecting the health of women and unborn children. Look, there are a lot of health consequences associated with these abortion pills that are, done through the mail, through telemed. And what's happened over the last, probably the last decade, as we've seen more and more states pass pro-life laws restricting certain aspects of abortion, we've seen a move away from brick and mortar. the abortion clinics, kind of taking an Amazon approach to abortion and doing some of this through the mail and telemed. The women do not have the benefit of the interaction with the doctor, their health consequences associated with it. So I commend Texas for not waiting for the court to give them approval to do what they need to do.
You mentioned it. Yesterday was the Dobbs case before the Supreme Court. Many say it could overturn Roe v. Wade. Tony, read the tea leaves for us. How do you think the Supreme Court might rule on this case?
Well, Jen, I've never been good at determining what the court would do, but I will say this based upon the oral arguments and the questions and the comments made by the justices. It does look very promising that finally, after almost 50 years, we will see this issue that was snatched from the hands of the states, taken over by the court, saying that they were going to solve this issue once and for all. And we now know that they have done nothing but inflamed the debate around abortion, that it may go back to the states. So I feel very confident about that. And we've already seen what the states are doing, that they're aggressively taking on this issue. And that's the closest to the people. The only way our constitutional republic works is when we have the ability to work out our differences and come to a consensus, an agreement on policies, especially policies like this. Now, as you could see from the court yesterday, especially from Justice Sotomayor, the concern of the left is if Roe falls, which is really the house of cards that they've set up for all of this judicial activism, they're concerned about some of the other policy initiatives that the left has pushed on the American people through the court as well.
Tony, if SCOTUS, if the decision weakens or reverses Roe, what could that mean for the GOP in 2022 and maybe in 2024? Some suspect or some suggest it could fire up the Democratic base.
You know, I've read that, I've heard that, but here's the deal, John. The left has relied upon the courts. They can't pass this stuff legislatively. That's why they've gone to the courts to begin with. So I don't see this as a windfall of political activism for the left. Will some activists be upset? I'm sure they will, but they're not going to be able to get their agenda through the legislative process. If anything, I think this is going to help conservative pro-life lawmakers because this issue is going to go back to the states and pro-life activists are going to have to stay engaged, in fact, ramp up their engagement to ensure that what the court has now handed to the states, if they rule in that fashion, is followed through appropriately and life is protected at the state level.
All right, Family Research Council's Tony Perkins, we always appreciate you making time for us. Thanks,
Tony.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Jenna.
And when we come back, as we prepare for Christmas, a new take on an old Advent calendar.
Welcome back. The Advent season is upon us.
And for many families, it's a busy time of year, but one mom is working to help instill calm as we prepare to celebrate the birth of Christ. Here's CBN's Jennifer Wishon.
It's the most wonderful time of the year, but let's face it, for many families, Christmas time is chaotic. There are parties to plan, cookies to bake, gifts to buy, and after all the hustle, many people find themselves depleted come Christmas Eve. Mother and grandmother Melissa Carey has been there.
I really want to empower and equip moms with a way to take the chaos out of Christmas, how to have an intentional, peaceful Advent.
Carrie says she's longed for an Advent calendar that goes deeper than Mary, Joseph, and some camels.
I wanted more from the nativity set. I wanted more from the Advent calendar than stale chocolates. I knew that there was something so much richer and deeper to the story.
So she made one that you too can enjoy.
I looked at what the world had to offer in nativity scenes and creches, and then I looked at what the Word had to offer. What's in the Word about the Nativity? You know, what does the Bible tell us? And that's what I modeled the Christmas cabinet after.
Each day of Advent, families can open a drawer in her Christmas cabinet to find a piece of the story of Christ's birth.
These are completely biblically accurate. And for me, it was really important to start with the concept of atonement. Atonement is a really hard concept to understand, but it's the whole reason Jesus came. And so we start on the very first day with the high priest Zechariah going into the Holy of Holies to offer a sin atonement.
She includes a book which offers biblical biblical and historical text for each day of Advent, along with a question to immerse families deeper into the miraculous story.
Well, one of my favorite days is Bethlehem, and we talk about how Bethlehem is a very small village just a few miles south of Jerusalem. And we weave in the history of the Old Testament, and we weave in the prophecies. The prophet Micah says that from Bethlehem will come the Savior of the world. And my favorite part is Bethlehem. Anytime you see Beth, it means house of, but Bethlehem means house of bread, which is amazing because Jesus calls himself the bread of life.
Carrie's Christmas cabinet even includes a bag of real frankincense.
So it's really important for me to look at the historical significance of each one of the figures, tie in the Old Testament prophecies, the New Testament teachings, as well as the application from biblical history.
She's in awe of stories about how God is using her product, but she also offers free resources on her website for each day of Advent. For her, it's all about sharing the true meaning of Christmas.
The figure for December 24th is a Christmas gift. And we talk about how God sent Jesus as the best gift we could ever receive. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that each and every one of us who believe in him shall not perish but have eternal life.
Now Carrie has the Advent calendar she always wanted, and you can too. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News, Arlington, Virginia.
Finally tonight, the heart of Christmas at the heart of our nation. At the Supreme Court, a gathering in the front steps celebrating the greatest birth story ever told.
Indeed. The evangelistic ministry called Faith and Liberty set up a live nativity at the Supreme Court this morning, reminding the country what the season is truly all about.
Sing choirs of angels, sing in exaltation, sing, O ye citizens of heaven.
The Holy Family was joined by shepherds and live donkeys, cows, and camels. They passed by office buildings in the Capitol before settling in to share the message of hope. Always a great scene there on the steps of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's a beautiful tradition. She sounds wonderful, too. Sounds of the season.
Thanks so much for watching.
Have a great night.